spotted KPA patrols down on the beach. Use your binocs to tag them before you run in blind.
So hello and welcome. As time ticks on, ever more Xbox 360 titles are being added to the backwards compatibility catalog for the Xbox One. And being the Crysis fanboy that I am, I was especially pleased to hear that Microsoft had just recently released support for the Crysis Trilogy. Following this update, the remixed version of Crysis 1 that was released for digital download in 2011, Crysis 2 and 3 are now available to be played on Xbox One and Xbox One X. And to talk about this today, I've assembled a small portion of Raptor Team for a special mission, including my friend John Prophet Linneman. You still with us there, John?
I'm right here, Alex. Let's talk about some Crysis, but honestly, $50 says this video ain't the real reason we're here.
Yeah, well, until they're 5x5, we're on our own. But I think the best place to start really is kind of the chronological order of how the way these games released back in the day. With Crysis 2, a game that was designed around the limitations of consoles, unlike Crysis 1. Going back and playing this over again, in comparison to Xbox 360 footage that we have, and on the Xbox One and Xbox One X, back when playing it in 2011, the frame rate was not very good. We've talked about this before in previous videos, with it being generally all over the place with AI interactions and when lots of alpha would come on screen and things like that. Playing it through Xbox backwards compatibility, most of these problems are eliminated on both consoles, on Xbox One and Xbox One X. So going through sections that had been dropping frames all over the place on Xbox 360 now it is a much more consistent experience.
But I think this also reveals one of the main issues with it, though. The game doesn't feel as fluid as it should because it has an inherent frame pacing issue in the sense that it basically runs at 31 frames per second, I believe.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Which means that you're always going to end up with a mix of 16 millisecond spikes followed by 50 millisecond dips, which creates this sort of inconsistency in the performance. And this was pretty bad if you're playing on the original hardware because you're already getting actual frame rate dips, but even when you do hit the target, it's still not smooth. So the game just doesn't feel smooth on the older consoles. Whereas on Xbox One X here, we've basically reached the point where it's level, but it still doesn't feel as fluid as it should as a result of this 31 FPS cap thing.
Yeah, and not only that, there's also tinier other things that, going back in time, make Crysis 2, even in this backwards compatibility form, not feel completely smooth. And it's not just this, frame time problem
right
everywhere, but to get this working on console back then, they had to kind of reduce the frame rate of a lot of in-world elements. You see things like debris and particles running at less than half refresh rate usually, so it looks like they're less than 15 FPS at times. There's, like shadows moving in the distance that, are updating maybe a quarter of the frames. And then objects that are kind of, as you move through the world, disappearing and reappearing right in front of you, popping in and out of existence.
Yeah, it does kind of make it seem as if the whole world is slightly falling apart before your viewpoint, where, it's not as temporally stable, I guess you could say, as a result. Like all the pop-in and the half rate or less objects appearing on screen. I mean, this was Crytek's first attempt at consoles, and obviously they pushed hard on the VFX pipeline. Lots of motion blur effects and, huge explosions and particles and some other cool things. Bokeh depth of field, like all of that stuff was really impressive for the time of release. But you can see that on the simulation side, even with the more constrained viewpoint of running within a city like this, they really, really struggled to get their performance where it needed to be. And so, but even when it is running smoothly here on Xbox One, those elements you mentioned there, it does give it this janky feeling that's just not great to play.
Yeah, and there's, other things that are just kind of as a result of the time period when it came out that make it feel and look less visually great these days. Crytek pioneered temporal anti-aliasing in 2011, with this, and like Halo Reach before it. It has an insane ghosting problem. So in general gameplay, everything's ghosting on the screen, more or less. It mixes with the motion blur all right, but it's another layer of blur on top of things. And then you bring up something like a scope, which with its transparency in front of the screen makes everything ghost. And at 30 FPS with these frame time problems, it just generally looks really messy.
this was kind of a staple of that time period, as you say. There was different games attempting this sort of anti-aliasing solution at the time. Like, it was the first foray. This was also around the time that we started to see things like FXAA, I believe, like using post-processing to clean up the image and, you know, other tricks like this. It was kind of a new thing. And yeah, with Crysis 2, it works okay on the PC if you're at a high frame rate, but here, the low frame rate, especially when, you know, with the way it works with alpha, which is to say not well, it's especially noticeable with foliage as well. And there's a lot of trees and such in this world, and, you know, you just look at them and they just kind of have this messy, ghosty appearance. I don't think it's as severe as Halo Reach, honestly.
No.
But the after image effect is certainly noticeable. So that's sort of a relic of this era.
But when moving on to the next game, this is something that was immediately alleviated. I think they kind of changed the way they did post-process anti-aliasing as this TAA in Crysis 1 remastered on consoles. I mean, it's not remastered technically. It's more like Crysis 1 remixed. But moving over to that game, Crysis 1 was kind of retrofitted to be working on consoles at all. Originally, the game, in its default normal form that we saw on PC, if they just ported that over, it would have run way worse. So there's a lot of bespoke, customized assets in Crysis 1 Remastered, and a lot of changes to interactivity in the world, which made it at all run in general. But even going back to old footage of the Xbox 360 version of that game, it was not running well.
Yeah, it's an interesting port because, you know, at the time of release, people didn't think that Crysis could be done on consoles, and they were right.
Yeah.
So this version is quite different, as you say, but it is fascinating to see that they've taken what they learned in making Crysis 2 for the consoles and applied it here. So, you know, very heavy on post-processing. They added the bokeh depth of field. You have that really nice per-pixel motion blur on everything. You know, the tone mapping is there. They're using image-based lighting, as you've mentioned before. But, you know, due to memory constraints, they can't place it everywhere around the world. But it does end up with a look that's neat and different. And historically, I think it's a cool thing to have, and I'm glad that it exists. But yeah, it was extremely poor. It was not a well-performing game on 360, and much, much, much less so if you played it on PlayStation 3, where it's almost in that like N64 GoldenEye territory half the time. It's very, very slow.
Yeah, I'm grateful though that it does exist like as a historical curiosity, and it can be played by more people now. And the best part is that it performs much better than it did back then. This of all the Crysis Trilogy games, this one I would say still runs the worst, and I'll talk about why in a second. But in general, you're looking at the exact same kind of performance setup that you saw on Crysis 2, where playing on Xbox One and Xbox One X, general gameplay is 30 FPS with that frame pacing issue, but it holds it for the most part. Xbox One, though, can have some slight dips due to what I presume are CPU-related moments with AI or certain number of objects spawning on screen at one moment.
So I helped you here by capturing 360 footage. I specifically chose this scene because it's kind of it's a rough test for the system. When you drive into the village here, you're basically activating a lot of AIs. There's a lot of destructibles in the environment. It's a complex environment. You can go inside all the different buildings. It's kind of like a murder test on the 360, and the frame rate drops horribly.
And going through them and putting them side by side here, you can see how the Xbox 360 and Xbox One, when kind of going around the corners and looking over the entirety of the town with all of its activated AI and the long view distance, drops into the teens. You know, both of these, and it's not completely unexpected because CPU-related games and backwards compatibility, you know, like where they're dropping frames on the CPU, Jaguar in the consoles as it is now is not that much better in a couple of aspects than those CPUs found on the Xbox 360. So dropping frames at similar moments for similar reasons is unsurprising. But the cool thing here is how generally awesome the Xbox One X performs in this scene. I was pretty surprised. It's keeping in the 20s at its worst, mid-20s at its worst, but other than that, if you're playing this without doing this murder scenario that John created, it's going to be at around 31 FPS, or even strangely way above that. Here, look at the scene right here. When just going through and a checkpoint saves, for some reason in that moment, VSync turns off, or at least the cap for VSync being a 31 FPS cap turns off, and you can see Crysis one on Xbox One X running at an unlocked frame rate, going into mid-30s, low 40s and things like that. So you already had this consistently inconsistent experience at 31 FPS, and then it's even more inconsistent when, for some reason, the VSync lock breaks. And I had this in all the games at some point on both Xbox One and Xbox One X. I have no idea why this happens.
That is so weird. I don't remember encountering that on 360, though. So I'm wondering if this is related to the fact that when you run these on backwards compatibility mode, VSync is, normally it's forced. If you look here on Xbox 360, there's a constant tearing that occurs right along the top of the screen. And it's not horrible, but it is there. And that is obviously eliminated across the Xbox One consoles. And maybe there's something related to that happening there.
They do turn off the VSync lock when loading.
Oh, yeah.
Like between levels. And I was wondering if it had to do with that, like background streaming, it's loading, and the logic to, cap the frame rate all of a sudden stops working for some reason because it's loading. Because it only happened after what seemed to be checkpoint loads, which usually in all these games, in spite of the fact that they're at 31 FPS, when there is a checkpoint load or a game save load, it will dip momentarily as the game pauses. And there's a number of these things that are probably due to the fact that they were streaming so much that it does that pause dip. And, there's other artifacts in the game world from that, like textures loading in slower than they would because, the cache settings are those that are just from the Xbox 360. They can't edit that game code to make it, the textures better up close all the time. And that kind of gets to another point I want to talk about. In all these games, I'm pretty sure Crytek had like a per surface
That's right.
anisotropic filtering. And while playing through it on Xbox One X, I was surprised to see that a number of the textures into the distance didn't look that great. And I'm not sure that for the exact reason of this.
That's right. So this is an interesting thing, though. Something I've noticed recently in a number of backwards compatibility titles is that the promised 16x AF doesn't always seem to be working as it should. And in fact, I actually mentioned this to one of the Microsoft guys, and they were surprised by it, and they issued a patch to fix it.
Ooh.
But it does seem to still be appearing in some of these releases. So I don't think that this is necessarily intentional in all cases, and I'm wondering if there's some kind of bug or like oversight or something going on here that's preventing that from working as it should. And again, because of the whole per surface approach to Crysis, maybe it's just going to be this way.
Yeah, maybe it's also a MIP mapping issue where the MIP distance is set to be extremely low on these consoles anyway. So you're running 16 times AF over a low MIPed texture, or a high MIPed texture, sorry. It's not going to look great. It's just going to look like a cleaner, blurry texture.
That's true. But I think at this point, though, just to keep things moving, I think we should move on to Crysis 3, because this is the one where I feel like it's the most ambitious visually for the consoles. Obviously, Crysis 1 as a game is more ambitious, but this is where I feel like they really found their footing in terms of getting everything working as you would expect.
Yeah, it looks, I kind of said this, it looks like just a less pretty version of the PC version. It retains a lot of the graphical effects. I mean, not a lot of the small fidelity ones, but like big things like screen space reflections, which I'm not really sure how often that happened at all on consoles in last gen. They're found on water surfaces in the game. And in general, the look, when you're just out there in the world in Crysis 3 on Xbox One X backwards compatibility or on Xbox One, it looks generally pretty great. There's all this vegetation moving, swaying in the breeze. It's thick, it's dense, it has a lot of the atmospheric look that you found on the PC version.
Yep.
And playing it, it also felt the best out of all of these in general. One due to, I think, the fact that they had more time with the engine. They had more time to make a stable art pipeline where art assets look, cleaner, better, more consistent with each other. And the performance here. So this is the best performing game out of all the ones in backwards compatibility right now. Unlike the other versions where their frame pacing issue manifests at 31 FPS, where it goes up to 16 milliseconds and then down to 50. Here in Crysis 3, for the most part, it actually just goes up. It ticks upwards to 16.6 ms.
Yeah, that's surprising.
And so it's still inconsistent, but it's just more or less inconsistent in one direction, making the game feel better, at least with the motion blur.
Right.
It hides it a bit, but you can still feel that something isn't right when playing it. But it's better than the other titles.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this game also revealed something interesting to us, I think, is that there was always a suspicion that the CPU was being hammered by Crysis 3, because, there's certain areas in the PC where that's definitely the case. And if that were actually the case, then I wouldn't have expected such a massive boost in performance on Xbox One. But we are seeing that, which suggests that the GPU is, in general, the more limiting factor here.
That surprised me too, because on PC, looking over the fields here, running through it, unless you're running on something like an i5 or higher, the chance of it dipping below 30 FPS is pretty high on modern PCs. And going back in time, looking through some presentations that Crytek did, it's revealed that the amount of frame time it was necessary to render these graphs and things like that was similar on PC as it was on consoles, at least on Xbox 360. So they did a number of specific optimizations, reducing instances and like that, to actually make it rather CPU efficient in general. So the game now on Xbox One and Xbox One X is more or less flawless, minus a few select sequences on Xbox One, like when an explosion happens here, or in the intro level, just kind of, I'm presuming what is a combination of all the objects and view distance. Yeah, so, but in general though, a locked 31 FPS if you find that great. But yeah, I guess the general question after all of this though is, how much value is there in going back and playing these titles on Xbox One X or Xbox One, John? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so for me, it's more of a curiosity thing. Crysis 2, I think, is not one I would really mess with on consoles. Crysis 3 is fascinating to look at. Crysis 1, though, is the only one I would consider actually playing, and that's only because I kind of, the historian in me likes to examine different conversions of games like this. It takes me back to that, looking at ports of PC games to N64 or Saturn. How do you pull off an ambitious game on a lower power platform? And Crysis 1 is such a different experience compared to the PC version. It's worth having. But Crysis 2 and Crysis 3, if you have access to a PC version, it's absolutely the way to go. And that's mainly because these are not Xbox One enhanced specifically. This is just normal BC, which means you still get the low sub 720p resolution. And Crysis 3, because of the way they do anti-aliasing there, it's a very shimmery game. Even at high resolution on PC, it's not the cleanest game in the world, and it's noticeably less clean here on the consoles. Now, if they had managed to enhance these, run these at the near 4K resolution that it would have been, then I could say maybe Crysis 3 would still be worth playing on here.
I feel very similar. I feel like historical curiosity and just for comparison's sake, playing Crysis 3 is interesting. And it had the best performance out of all of them. And Crysis 1, just because I love the game so much, my playing it again on Xbox One X was it was fun. It was visually inconsistent and had a lot of problems, but I was just really interested in seeing what they were doing to get this work at all. But in general, man, if you look at the minimum specs of all the PC versions of these games, and the fact that the lowest graphical settings for Crysis 2 and 3 are better than those found on console with better performance, I can really recommend playing these on PC if you want to go back to at least Crysis 2 and 3. Crysis 1, for curiosity's sake, yeah, play it. It could be fun.
Yeah, I think this raises an interesting point about backwards compatibility in general, as it's like, for my money, I would rather see Xbox exclusive games brought over specifically for the X Enhanced program. Like when Gears of War 3 was made available for that, that's awesome. You can't play that anywhere else. But Crysis is obviously going to be better, way better on the PC in this case. But even in, they just released Half-Life 2 for the PC, and I don't think we're going to have the chance to really look at this on the channel, but I did play it briefly, and it looks awesome. It's native 4K Half-Life 2. It looks a lot like the PC version, but the frame rate is lower, and it has bad frame pacing issues, just like Crysis actually, which is really frustrating. But it's like, with as rare as those titles are, I can understand for console players it's nice to have 4K Half-Life on the go now, but I would have much rather see X enhanced games that you can't get on the PC
anywhere else. Yeah,
exactly.
And that kind of sums up the entire video. You can only get this Crysis experience here at 31 FPS. But John, thanks for talking about this with me today, and I really hope you all enjoyed watching this video and this discussion I've had with John, and if you did like it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.
And I guarantee that you would enjoy it. Of course, if you want guarantees, buy it toasted.
Yeah, and if you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell button in the corner, which allows you to watch a digital Foundry video as soon as it's posted. Yeah, if you would like to talk about the console versions of Crysis with me or John, follow us on Twitter. And as always, this is John and Alex.
The Alpha Ceph?
God damn, nothing but bodies.